All right, well, welcome to Big Book Compendium. Um, Last week we covered a lot of history. Um, it was we looked at like the early laws and discipline, that we saw in the world, and how different countries had different tortures and stuff for alcoholics and all that stuff. They had some, England had the barrel they put people in, and with with the arms coming out and the legs coming out, would make them walk around town, stuff like that. But then we got, into the actual aspect of it, and you know, um, the one thing was is we talked about. I'm trying to find my notes here, so I'm just gonna run through this real quick. I'm gonna put this up here again, just as a review. Um, so we talked about, Benjamin Rush. He was like the original Surgeon General. He was kind of a made man because he was Washington's doctor, or saved Washington's life during the Revolutionary War. But he was also like the first Surgeon General, and he declared alcoholism a disease. And he said this was a physical disease. And it got enough people's, a lot of people said, "Oh no, this guy's crazy. It's just sin and weak will." But a lot of people listened, and that temperance movement started. And like Benjamin Rush's solution is abstinence, recovery plan none. Temperance movement, moderate drinking, that lasted for a good number of years off and on. Solution is moderation, recovery plan none. But then you had a very politically driven group called a Total Abstinence Society. We went pretty deep into that last week, and it says speaks for itself. It was like temperance movement, but it was total abstinence, and it was pushed by politicians and and media. With they would try to promote it, in churches too, and they had no recovery plan. The solution is abstinence. And then there's the Washingtonians, and this is the group I find fascinating because their solution is abstinence, and a recovery plan is fellowship. And they couldn't agree upon like religious or spiritual, or what kind of God it was. They couldn't agree upon any type of principles. And they just did, for their whole program was based on people coming up like on a stage and telling their story. And sounds familiar. And they had 700,000 members after 4 years. And after 7 years of existence, there was zero. They couldn't find anybody, that was involved in it. Um, and the Emmanuel movement stirred up out of Boston, and this is kind of like influenced by these other groups a little bit, but they wanted to prove these other groups wrong. The Emmanuel movement, and their solution was spiritual, but they didn't have no recovery plan. They had no principles to get you there. They had great ideas. They had psychology on one hand, and the other hand, they had religion. It just didn't mesh. And we mentioned that some of the people that came out of there were very interesting. Um, you had the um, uh, uh, you had different people that came out of that group. Richard Peabody came out of that group, and then Courtney Baylor. And Richard Peabody was the guy who wrote Common Sense to Drinking. We'll talk a little bit more about that tonight. But Common Sense to Drinking had words like half measures of ill is nothing and real alcoholic and stuff. But his book was only like the first 43 pages of a big book. There was no, he did not, he believed that a good schedule was a great recovery plan, keeping yourself busy. And he died of alcoholism after 8 years sober. But um, then we got into the Oxford group, and with the Oxford group, we talked about the absolutes. Um, absolute honesty, purity, unselfishness, and love was like what grounded them together. That's what Frank Bookman, who founded the Oxford group, that was what, after he made restitution to some people he was angry at, he came up with those absolutes, and he took people through them. And then he met Sam Shoemaker. Sam Shoemaker had a spiritual awakening results to the absolutes. And then Shoemaker wrote the principles. And Shoemaker wrote a lot of this stuff. He had the 5 basic concepts. I'm not going to read them all, but you can see them. Um, sin was the problem, and then 6 basic concepts of the Oxford group, just like men are sinners, men can be changed, confession. But really, then you get to the 5 C's, and this is really where AA starts to kind of get intertwined in all this. You know, you have confidence, confession, conviction, conversion, continuance. And you have the 5 aspects of confession. Confession must be made to start in your life. Confession is a transaction that must be made between a soul, God, and another. Sounds familiar, you know, but really the bread and butter is the 5 procedures of the Oxford group. And that was surrender our past, present, and future into God's keeping and direction, the sharing of our sins and temptations with another given to God, a restitution to all those whom we have harmed directly and indirectly, which means amends, listening for God's guidance and carrying it out. That sounds like step 11. And 5, to keep the conversion experience real by carrying the Oxford message to others. So basically, Bill, this is where it gets interesting. We know what happened to Bill Wilson. And if you look at this, let me see if I got my timeline thing. Oh, it's back here. Hold on. Give me 1 second. This is all over the place right now. There it is. So basically talked about Roland Hazard going to Carl Jung and how he spent a whole year with him, and we went deep into that last week, and how Jung couldn't help him, but he recommended spiritual experience for him. Basically, find a movement he can get involved with that will help him. And he actually went to Boston because he knew who Courtney Baylor was, and he hooked up with him. Well, Courtney Baylor wasn't a member of the Oxford group, but he knew about them. And what Baylor did though with his patients was he worked with them for 2 years, but with Roland he only worked for like 8 weeks, and he did more inventory, but I do not know what that pertained. But a lot of people have speculation that written more inventory was something he brought outside the Oxford group, and then because Roland went to Ebby and Ebby went to Bill, so maybe there's a connection there. I like to find more information about that. But then, so Bill, has an interesting thing that we talked about, and the most interesting aspect is Bill is using this 5-step program, you know, and surrender past, keeping in God's keeping and direction. Basically, he would walk up to Kevin and say, "Hey, Kevin, are you ready to turn your life into God's keeping?" And you're a dry drunk. You're like, who the hell are you? Go away. And so that's why it says in the big book he was unsuccessful with his first half dozen prospects. So he goes to Lois, and Lois goes, "Well, you're clean, right? You're clean. That's all that matters." And he goes, "But go talk to Silky." So go talk to Silkworth. Silkworth goes, "What are you telling these guys?" And he tells him, "Well, God." And he goes, "Dude, you're messing up. You got to tell them the medical hopelessness. That's the powerlessness, the allergy obsession." The next person he talked to, less than maybe 4 days later, was Dr. Bob. And Dr. Bob said if he would have told me anything other than that hopelessness, he would have thrown him out of his office. And it wouldn't have lasted 5 hours, it would have been 5 minutes. This is God working in there, and and even like Silkworth, the solution he brought to people was abstinence. He didn't have a recovery plan, but Bill did, and that's the interesting thing, and then it turned into Alcoholics Anonymous, and really kicks in the gear. And that's pretty much where we ended up last week. We did talk about the 6 steps, and I don't know if I even put them on here or not. I forgot. I think I did. So, but basically, that's kind of like where we left off, and we were at kind of the birth of Alcoholics Anonymous. I'll get more into that as we go through the book, because I don't want to be jumping. I don't want to be repetitive. But what's interesting is with Alcoholics Anonymous. Hold on 1 second. So, last time I said that we would go over some important books that these guys read, and they were really big into studying and gaining more understanding of like believing in faith and prayer, even deeper than the Oxford group guys were, if that can be believed, because Oxford group guys were hardcore, but they're also strictly a Christian movement. Um, but they're in a confession, forgiveness, selfless service, things like that. And they wanted to learn more about courage and calmness because they were experiencing that. They wanted to learn what their experience, tolerance and healing and all that. What the heck's happening with me? Because they didn't have a lot of people to bounce off of. There's only a few of them. And on a flip side, they also wanted to study resentments and fears and social dishonesty, guilt, and all that stuff. You know, they want to make sense of it all. And a lot of these books were, roadmaps, to the stuff that that they could explain. They wanted to, like I said, they wanted to learn more. And this era with these books, they call the flying blind period. Like I said, there was no big book. There's a 6-step program that varied amongst each individual. Well, I mean, each individual, each area. But they're pretty much the same Oxford group steps, similar, but they put that powerless on top of it. But they were all brand new on fire. That's the best way I put it. So these books helped explain to them what was happening in the program, what was going on with them. A great part of what they were deep into, they learned from the Oxford, was early morning quiet time, meditation, journalizing thoughts. You know, um, unlike the non-alcoholic OG members, the drunks, did not, um, you know, well, let me rephrase it. So the OG members, basically Oxford group members, they didn't want the drunks there. And part of it was because the Oxford group was about, to be a member, you had to believe in God. And that was a big argument. We'll get in a minute about early AA. But, you know, that's the thing. And a lot of these books, a big part of their early morning quiet time. And the one thing I want to mention is this: the guys that when Bill, after he met Bob, and this was Bob's idea, Bob was sneaky. Bob was a sneaky dude. And what I mean by that is Sister Ignatius Hospital, they used to sneak in alcoholic people by saying they had stomach ailments. Because back in those days, if you brought a guy to the hospital and said, "This guy's alcoholic, can we take care of him?" "Oh, well, there's asylums across the street." And you would lose him, sometimes for years. So they say he had stomach ailments and they work on him for like 8 days. And it all sorts of great, amazing stuff there. But this has broke the mold. And Dr. Bob was sneaky in another way. He taught Bill is he started bringing guys into the Oxford group that weren't Christian, but they told the guys, "Don't tell them that, because these hands can help you." And they would sit there and take them to the Oxford group meeting, sit down with them afterwards, and say, "Okay, well, here's a way you can look at it this way." You know, and they chased some guys. Some guys. There was a guy named Dr. Mick, I think his name was, and he was like non-Christian, and he did not want. He couldn't. He's completely shut on it. He could have been A number 3. So I'm gonna put this slide up of these books, and I'm going to explain these books a little bit the best of my ability. Some of these books we've heard, but what I did is I went through different lists over the years. Some came from my grand sponsor 20 years ago. He did over 30 years ago. Some I found online, and some were, most of these books I've come across and read myself, which is really cool. But these are the ones I felt were the most important. I found a lot of lists online that are really irrelevant to what they did and hearsay. But so number one, I have, these aren't in any order, what's best and what's number one, but just the first one is the book Variety Religious Experience by William James. Bill Wilson read this after his spiritual experience in Towns Hospital. Ebby brought him the book. And, it was the foundation of Bill's, first step theory about how deflation could lead to an awakening. He read that in there, but also explained different forms. There's not, people think this book is just about the spiritual awakening, spiritual experience. There's all different levels he talks about here. So it's really good for them to read. I would highly recommend, if you haven't read this book, but read it twice. read it twice and then mark the parts in the book like the first 30 pages in there are a pretty deep, hard read. And then after that it starts kicking into gear and you recognize the lingo. I like to read those parts, over again and take people through it. Um, the one book that really got to me, and I read it when I got into Carl Jung because of, a history, is Modern Man in Search of His Soul. And it really explained, what was it's a perfect introduction to new philosophical ideas and concepts for a new society. I mean, it was perfect. It covers man's needs for awakening, how negative, um, all sorts of things, how negative attitude can change through awareness, creates, how, um, basically targeting self-esteem, all sorts of things. And a lot of the things that Bill found out was better on paper than it was. Maybe that's remember the emotional rearrangement that Jung tried with Roland could have very well been the stuff he talks about in this book. But I just one of those things is you have to be spiritually awake to understand even part of this book, but it's awesome to read, you know. Um, he talks about in the book is that faith does not happen without effort, and it must happen through experience, and you must carry on that experience. So it's very good for them to read. The book that I'm sure some of you have read and heard about, Sermon on the Mount by Emmett Fox, and this book was groundbreaking of its time. I mean, Emmett Fox spoke in New York, and a church that's no longer there. It was huge, and he would sell it out every other week when he would be there. The church would be half full on a normal Sunday. When he was there, it was standing room only because he was this new thought, philosophy, and metaphysics were so popular. And if you read the book, and I always thought, okay, yeah, you can see the parts and we agnostics in this book and different things, but really about how to approach an individual. And a lot of it is super influences working with others. And I'll read it when we get to working with others. But there's a lot of cool stuff in the book, like God is the only power, God is perfect and good. God is within, forgive, the deep forgiveness of others, scientific prayer, um, God conscious gets deep into, but really moving and taking it somewhere. Like how once you're awake, you go with it. And, this is a healing thing he talks a lot about. We must, like, clearing up resentments. So the next one is a groundbreaking book of its time. I think it came out in 1908. Is A Man Thinketh by James Allen. And this book underlines the premise of, the noble thoughts make a noble person. And it was big at the time. These guys read it. In short, you are what you think. As a man thinketh, so he is, like the Bible says. And he really focused on fear. He also said that fear was the worst kind of fear and stuff like that. But he talks a lot about fear and how a calm, serene mind is important, and that a strong man cannot help a weaker person unless they, find the strength in them first, and stuff like that. And the next one was Common Sense of Drinking. And these first five are pretty right on what they read the most. Um, but the Common Sense of Drinking, um, again, I mentioned a minute ago, huge influences, but basically the first 43 pages of the big book, but it taught them a lesson. And, the guy died in 43. When he did, their jaws dropped because they didn't know him personally. They read his book, but they didn't agree with his recovery plan. And but they he used the word powerlessness, and he used the word alcoholic and addict, I mean, sorry, alcoholic and alcoholism, when only the medical profession used it. So no one heard those terms before. It was drunkards before that. So he was really groundbreaking. He used the word like surrender at half measures avails nothing, and manifestations and stuff like that. So that was a big book. And then the writings of Samuel Shoemaker. And I could list a bunch of these books he did. A lot of them it's hard to differentiate. A lot of his writings were just handed out to Oxford Group, and then after years later, his family published in a book. So it's hard to tell. But the one book he had was called National Awakening, which I read. It's pretty deep. It's pretty deep, and it's just about awakening. And he has another one called A Real Religion, a religion that works, confident faith, how to find God, you know, a conversion, first century Christian fellowship, which was originally an Oxford group. But these books were all read closely by the early AA members, and Shoemaker, they knew he was a huge influence on AA, and he was what they wanted. And one of the reasons Shoemaker left Oxford Group was because they forced the A guys out. He didn't like that. But he was such a huge influence on Bill that Bill asked him to write to, expand the 6 steps to 12. And he said to Bill, he says, no, you got to do that. You're the guy here. You're the brains, you know. But his book, it was all his writings were groundbreaking. Um, Such as, like he talks a lot about, God, let God manage your life, and do for yourself what you can't do for yourself, type of stuff. you know we give a control to God, you're reborn, and stuff like that. A decision without action is useless, and stuff like that. A lot about self-centeredness, a lot about selfishness. The next book on here is Soul Surgery. I have a version of this book, but it's not the version of this book. And what I mean is, a lot like the red book that came out with Alcoholics Anonymous, they've been publishing companies get rid of them and take out the good stuff, or religious stuff. But Soul Surgery, this is basically the outline of the Oxford Group program. And it was the first real Oxford Group book. And it's basically what it explained. It has directions and stuff in there. They read it really close because they were doing those principles. It's the only thing they had. Another group that's book similar to that is What is the Oxford Group? Um, this was written by a committee. That's why it says unknown. Um, so while Soul Surgery outlined the Oxford Group methods, What is the Oxford Group explained the group's range of practices without getting into detail. So this was like the one you read beforehand, and the next one you read after. And then the other one was For Sinners Only. And this was written by Arthur J. Russell, who was an Oxford Group member. He's actually very pro AA, which was really cool. I never joined it, but his book is like known as the Oxford Group Bible, and it tells a story of the Oxford Group movement and his encounters with Frank Buckman and Shoemaker. But he talks about the 9 ingredients of love in this book, and that was a big thing for the Oxford Group. And he breaks it down. It's fascinating. I only have a pamphlet from it, but it talks about I think the 9 ingredients of love were like patience, kindness, humility, curiosity, I think, generosity, unselfishness, good temper, stuff like that. You know. The next one is Anne Smith's journal. Bill Wilson called her the mother of Alcoholics Anonymous, and she assembled this journal from 33 to 39. It's very hard to find, and you're lucky if you can find it. You might be able to download it somewhere, but again, somewhere it's kind of tweaked, by people over the years. But she was big into daily devotional. Her journal directions, she would give to the guys. And before the big book, she laid out Oxford Group stuff so they could grasp it. She was like a tutor for these guys. She explained to them where they're at. She was almost like a sponsor in a sense, but they just loved her. But she was already deep in the Oxford Group for years when Bill hooked up with Bob, when Bob finally got right with himself and made amends, maybe right with others and made amends and stayed sober. She'd been around for years. So anyone that says that Bob didn't, some people say, oh, Bob never knew what he was doing in the Oxford Group. That's bullshit, because Bob knew what he was doing, because his wife was one of the leaders. But she really set forth a spiritual program. She's the one that influenced Bill, that, she really could describe spirituality as well. That's the best way to describe it. And then you can find these on silkworth.net, the medical journals of William Duncan Silkworth. These are all over the place. And again, I commend silkworth.net for putting these up and getting rid of, people's, would put up ones that were edited down because they're too long-winded and short. No, you want the real ones. And one of them came out in 31 called Manifestation of an Allergy, which really broadens the allergy obsession and really explains the allergy well. In the real alcoholic and non-alcoholic. You can find that in there. Another one's A New Approach to Alcoholism. Another one is Rehabilitation of Alcoholics. You can just you'll just go through and find them on there. Um, there's one that's called Slips in Human Nature, and he wrote after A existed and why guys slip and how they can come back. It's very good read, and they read it a lot, real closely. They've really looked up to Silkworth, especially in New York. The Upper Room, you hear that term a lot with churches called Upper Room and Bible studies and stuff. The Upper Room, the Oxford Group, Glenn C. was a big Oxford Group writer. It's just a daily devotional, and it was written in a very simple way that they could follow. And the next one is the writings of philosopher Ralph Waldo Trine. He was a leader of the New Thought movement, which was big, and he contributed spiritual words. He gave a spiritual language, and he was big into the New Thought movement. Was basically spiritual rather than religious in a sense, but deeper than that, the metaphysics aspects and all that. He used words like higher power. That's where Bill got their word from, and fourth dimension, spirituality, and tons of other metaphysical terms. And then the number 14 was, this is one that I've heard about for years. It took me a while to find it. I never read the book. I just read pieces of it. And it's the writings of the Young People's Society of a Christian Endeavor. And these were young people. I mean, ages from 19 to 33. And they were this new thought process. They were followers of Trine and followers of Emmett Fox. And these A guys were like into these people, scientific prayer and seeking God's guidance, and deep devotional time. What do you do in the devotion? And these guys came and spoke to them, and they met with these guys because they're in the areas they lived in. And another book by Glenn C. from the Oxford Group was "I Will Lift Up Mine Eyes," and this was really closely read by Bill Wilson, and was required. It was actually required reading of early members before Big Book and all that, and even after that. You gotta remember when the Big Book came out, these guys didn't work out of the Big Book until Cleveland did in the early 40s. Like the Big Book wasn't even, Bill didn't write the Big Book as a sponsorship guide. He wrote it as a way to keep the book in that. We'll get into that in a minute because I'm gonna break that down, the Big Book being written. But I mean, it discussed the power of prayer to transformation of a person's life, this guy's book, and it was exactly where these guys were. So they kind of had these books in different reading orders, and sometimes there's certain guys, well, no, don't give him that book, give him this book. But discusses the difference between worshiping God and knowing about God and knowing God. There's a big difference. A lot of people know about God but don't know God, and that's the way that book broke the mold in that aspect. So I'll put this list in there at the end if anyone wants it. I'll put it in the chat. It's a lot of good books in there, and if there's any more you want to add to the chat, throw them in there too, that you know about from the early days. Any questions you have, throw them in the chat. I'll try to answer them at the end. So we talked last week about how A formed. Bill met Bob. They stayed with Bob for 1 month while Bob was trying to be sober. Finally, Bob makes his amends and stays sober, and he stays with him for 2 more months. But I want to talk about how the Big Book was written, because it really forms everything. And we're going to talk about Bob and the first 10 or 15 guys later as we come across it in the book. But so fast forward to the fall of 37. A's been around for 2 years, not called AA time. But Bill and Bob were, they were at a gathering, and they basically were counting noses at that gathering. And their word of mouth recovery program, consisted of 6 steps, had grown fast. And they realized they had about 40 members in that room or more, maybe like 48. I know it was under 50, but they both realized they're onto something big. And both these guys were big thinkers, and there was no fail in these guys. And Bill, gave the idea. It was that night Bill went home to Lois, and he says, I'm not going back to business, because he was taking 6 months off. I'm not going back. I'm going to focus full time on Alcoholics Anonymous in the future of it. I know it's honest. He felt very guided in doing that. And in the spring of 38, There were only two meetings, Akron and New York. Um, Bill came up with the idea to help bring AA to other states. And his proposed idea was a speaking tour. But the problem was when like they looked at him, they go, well, no one knows who we are. Who's going to take us seriously? And then the big thing was there was no money. They had no money to back it. So they came up with a new project called Book of Experience. And a book of experience would describe how to get and stay sober. And that was the focus of it. But the cool thing, about Bill and these guys, they thought big. They never said, "Oh, we might be a little big. We might be in a channel." They thinking everything that happened, they envisioned. They wanted they knew that they could create a groundbreaking book, and that could change the world. There were, in their minds, there's no, like I said, there's no failure. Again, they needed money. So Bill went to Charles B. Towns, that's Towns Hospital in New York City. Towns started that in 1908. It was the only hospital for alcoholic and drug addiction. And it was a trippy place. It was sweets. And you would go to the detox, and they would, they'd all bail down a treatment and all that stuff. And then they had Silkworth, telling you how sick you were. And after, basically after Towns saw what happened to Alcoholics Anonymous, Towns, um, you know, he saw what Bill had done with alcoholics and his hospital, at his hospital, and he offered Bill to be the manager of the hospital. Silkworth's medical director, you're the manager of this place, and you can use your 12 steps with these guys. We have our treatments, you can do the steps. And Bill's seeing dollar signs. He's a stockbroker. So when the money issue was brought up to Bill, he says, "Oh, I can go work at we could make our office Towns Hospital in New York City." And one of the members, I don't know who it was, says, don't you realize if we want to survive, we can never be professional?" And that was a big statement. If they do that, it was so important to not, not just be about money. They'd rather be broke than be professional. They don't want to be a business. They don't want anything to get in the way. They don't want people to turn away and because they're rich. Then they were offered good money by a publishing company who were willing to give them upfront money. Everybody was for it, except for Bill and his right-hand man, Hank Parkhurst. So, Hank Parkhurst was a businessman and Bill was a stockbroker. And they saw an easier way to make money than what companies were offering them. So Hank Parkhurst created what's called Works Publishing Company. And he and Bill sold shares of Works Publishing Company at $25 per stock, I think it was, or something, per value, which is like $325 a day or more. And so that's one way they made money, but it's a small amount of money because no one knows who they are. And then they hooked up with Rockefeller, who they asked for $50,000. That's 600. That's a lot of money today. I think it's about $800,000 today. And he declined because every time he's given money to people like that, their groups would go under. And he gave them $5,000, and that's about $65,000 today. And if Silkworth got Charles B. Towns to donate $2,500, that's $42,000 today. And that's, they started getting some money on the side. And Bill was the principal author of the big book. He had never written a book. Now take this in for a second. Bill got sober on December 11th, 1934. AA, the big book was released on April 10th, 1939. He began writing it in May of 38. He had a little over 3 years sober when he wrote the big book. Think about that next time you read the big book. Let that sink in for a second. But know this, when Bill was writing the book, he was on fire. God was flowing through his veins. He was very guided, and he knew every part needed to connect to the alcoholic. There was no failure in him. The funny thing, think about this for a second. When they put the committee together at the fourth edition, I talked to people, you know, and they wouldn't let anyone pretty much be involved unless they had 20 years. So when Bill Wilson showed up to help with, they would probably tell him to go away, you know, and like time doesn't matter. That proves that time doesn't matter, you know. Um, the other members that helped write the book were also on fire. Hank Parkhurst, 2 years. Prince Mayo, 2 years. Phil Smith, 2 years. Jim Burwell was perhaps the biggest influence of anyone in the tone of the big book, had 5 months. 5 months. Others who contributed had a few months. Let that all sink in for a second. Again, if it was written today, these guys would not be invited. They wouldn't be listened to. The book consisted of two separate sections: an outline of, as we know, the program recovery, and a collection of individual recovery stories put together by a newspaper writer. I forget his name. Sorry. But the first half of the book required a lot of work. The three main sources that they looked at using Bill was the Oxford Group, Sam Shoemaker, Soapworth, Jung's, the work of Jung, William James, and Peabody. And a lot of those other books that I've mentioned, and when Bill started to lay out the big book, he gathered members together to discuss the contents. And right off bat, these discussions led to huge debates, intense arguments, and Bill felt like a referee more than a leader of these people, and Bill knew the book had to appeal to everyone. So Bill divided the three committees. This is in New York, and I'll get an Akron in a minute, but the first committee they called the Conservatives, and this consisted of a faction of evangelistic Christian members. In other words, aggressive Christian members, Oxford Group hardcores that were involved in the drunk squad of the Oxford Group and were there. There was like 17 of them at the time, and at one point, in and out, but then none of them ever stuck because the whole, there wasn't any, the guys there, they wanted all to have belief in God. The group was led by Fitz Mayo, who was a hardcore OG member and evangelist minister's son. Episcopal minister's son. Fritz insisted the book must express Christian doctrine and use biblical terms, like have references and expressions and stuff. And he wanted like the Sermon on the Mount to be in there and stuff like that, from what I understand. And it must strongly emphasize the focus of the teachings of the Oxford Group and reference the Oxford Group. Lots of these guys in this committee were in and out of the OG for years. They strongly believed in that program should not be open to unbelievers, like I mentioned a minute ago, which is why Roland never joined AA. And the Oxford Group requirement, like I said, I'm repeating this again because I'm going to bring up in a second, was you had to be a believer. Second committee was called the Liberals, and these were the people that weren't religious, but they're more spiritual. Some were religious, but not hardcore, not as religious, let's just say. They were less aggressive and combative, more laid back, calm, and they were the voice of reason, and they were kind of the calm before the storm. And they were really got people to listen, and they are more on the same wavelengths as the universal aspect that Bill was listening to in his head. And they had no obligation, no objection against using the word God, but were against the overuse of the word God, and that it should be toned down. Fearing that they thought if there's too much God would scare people away, and they were dead set against Christian doctrine in biblical terms. Christianity. Spiritual, yes. Christianity, no. It's basically the way they said it. They didn't want they want a non-dogmatic idea that we're bringing in anybody, because we're talking about drunks here. I'm not talking about going in churches and recruiting people. And interesting to note is many of them were OG members that Bill snuck in to the OG to get well. So the third committee is the ones that really, when you read the big book and if you grew up religious or didn't, and you read it and you start seeing words you haven't seen before, came from these guys. And these were the radicals. And it's the agnostic and atheist members. And, as you know, an agnostic is someone that's skeptical about God. They want to see proof, you know. It's mental convictions without certain proof. And so is an atheist. They reject the idea of God. And these guys had a rep for being very outspoken, very argumentative, aggressive, very aggressive. And the committee was led by Jimmy Burwell. And that's the guy I mentioned at 5 months. And he was an atheist known for being aggressive and argumentative, but was also looked upon as possibly being the smartest person in the entire room. Super intelligent guy. For instance, when 80 members wanted all you need is membership to believe in God, Burwell, at the top of his head, looked at the guy and says, no, in this room, all you need is a desire to stop drinking. That's where it came from, right off his head, which of course, that became tradition number 3. And that's why all those Oxford group members I mentioned went out the door. Another leader of them, I mentioned a minute ago, is Hank Parkhurst, former agnostic, more in the universal aspect. So he's kind of he understood the liberal group, but he was more into these radicals. And Parkhurst was perhaps the most forgotten man in AA history. And Hank's story in the big book is The Unbeliever. He was kind of how to explain it? Like, he's the wizard behind the curtain. He was also had a significant role in the development of the big book. He was Bill's right-hand man when writing the book. He was the person that said, hey, the committee are upset about you, Bill. He played an extensive role in editing and the stories. He wrote chapter 10 to the employers. And a lot of the book was about Hank, a lot of the way that he handled life. Now, Ruth Hawk, who's a secretary, we'll get into her, but she said if it wasn't for Bill Wilson, the book would have never been written. It was for Hank, the book would never been published because he came with the publishing company. And Bill even said, if it was not for Hank, this book would have never been completed. No Hank, no book. That's all he kept saying when people complain about him. Hank was an amazing salesman, good talker, smooth businessman. But he was very transparent with Bill. He didn't hold back. Where other guys were, there used to be, when someone's bigger than, alcoholics, drug alcoholics, or ones trying to be spiritual or being spiritual, when someone's bigger than you a little bit at the beginning, you tend to be intimidated by them. And so they didn't want to stand up to Bill, and Hank did. And so he wrote a letter to Bill right before he was going to publishing. And he said, you have to make these changes. If you don't make these changes, I will make them for you. And the changes were from Burwell to change the end of the 3rd and 11th step and adding the words, God as you understood him. And it clicked, and Bill got it. It was a huge power play that worked. And the only reason Parkhurst is not a co-founder, because in September of 39, just months before the book came out, he relapsed and never got back on track. So him and Ebby are in the same boat. They could have been co-founders, but they could never stay sober. But this community, that group of radicals with Parkhurst and Burwell leading them, was totally against any religious ideas, tone, and direction, saying that an alcoholic would never buy into that BS, is what they basically said in their own words. They swore a lot, which got a lot of people roughed, and sometimes they would do that on purpose to piss people off. But they wanted to be no mention of God in the book. They wanted to refer to spiritual nature or power or light of the universe, sunlight of the spirit. Some of those words made it in there. A matter of fact, those words refer to God. These guys are the ones that, they brought all that stuff in, and they believed in that the book needed to be psychological was the way to go, not spiritual. And The title of chapter 4, We Agnostics, came from that group. It had a different title at first, and they suggested that title. And the original draft of step 2 came to believe that God could restore us to sanity, was the original draft. Burwell stepped up and says, off the top of his head again, how about a power greater than ourselves can restore us to sanity? Boom, they all agreed. Mostly, even though Burwell was a guy they didn't like a whole lot because he was combative, when he spoke, they listened, and he never brought something in that no one would say no way when he could bring it in. And Bill said those expressions were the lifesavers for alcoholics. When you look back upon it, and so every Tuesday, these committees would get together. Now imagine those guys crammed into one room, right? And how they did it was very interesting. Is they would gather at Bill's home, and he would read what he had written over the past week, and they couldn't say anything until he was done after a few minutes, and then they'd read a little bit more. So after reading his writings, it would get loud, and Bill said it sounded like the stock market, and they would say things like, "Why 12 steps?" and how many times he mentioned God? Well, what's this inventory? Why on our knees? Alcoholics won't buy this stuff, and huge debates. Some went on for months, and again, Bill said he was more like an umpire than an author. And but remember this, Bill was a salesman. He knew how to present the book to these people. And he also had a way of a calm demeanor that could ground this group to get them to listen to him. And he would let them argue, and he, okay, are we done? And he would have a plain look on his face. And even if he agreed with them, he a lot of times would never say. He would just let them go and then mold it into it. But he could explain to them the importance of every word. At the end of the day, they trusted him. And that's the most important thing. That's why Bill is magical. They trusted him because all they knew was there is something special about this man. They knew he was more than just a talented writer. He was a visionary. Because people would say, would show up at they would bring outsiders to their groups because, oh, here's John over here. He wrote a book. He wants to sit in our thing. Not alcoholic. And then the guy would say, well, he's a talented writer. And they would say, no, he's a visionary. That's what they believe. They all looked at Bill as a visionary. It's a perfect person to put the book together. But they knew he needed to be grounded in certain areas, and they knew there was something more than going on in Bill than the average person. So this is the interesting part right here. My grandpa used to explain this in great detail, but the book was limited to 400 pages because the publishing company, and they did not want to go bigger than that. And they had to edit out 800 pages. I mean, sorry, original was 800 pages. They edit out 400 pages to get to 400. So it's 800 pages at first. And the way my grand sponsor explained it, who's studied this stuff up and down, and and also I heard Schmitty talk about this too. I met Schmitty when I was 2 years sober. That's Dr. Bob's son. What they edited out was they had planned to put 40 stories in the back of the book, and the stories averaged like 16 pages a piece. It's a lot of pages right there, right? Well, they brought those down to 28, and they brought the pages down to average of 6. But the big question is, what was edited out of the first 164 pages? Now, if you Google Bill's story, and it's legit. It's 35 pages long, and it almost seems like a different story, but if you didn't know it as good as you know it, right? But it's 35 pages, and he was so mad that they told him to edit it down. He just rewrote it, and it was 16 pages, and he had to fight for that. So there's rumors that 2 or 3 chapters might have been removed. That's hearsay. We're not sure about that. Some have stated there was deeper emphasis on 6 and 7. The big rumor is this, and I did have some good backing in this because I don't like to go over too much stuff unless I believe it. But I believe it's true, that I believe that is like it's in Pass It On, it mentions and 8 Comes of Age, mentioned it too, about the 400 pages, 800 to 400 or something like that. But the thing about it was, um, A's World Service Center. I went there in New York City, and I met an archivist. First archivist they turned me on to didn't know anything. I mean, he knew a little bit. A lot of people there don't know a whole lot about the program. But then they go, oh, if you wait till 1 o'clock, Joe Smith's coming in. He knows everything. Well, I don't remember his name, but I'm just call him Joe. That guy was amazing, and he's since passed away because I did keep up with him for a little bit. He was like 89 years old, really cool guy. And he knew a lot of people. But the rumor was is this, and is that how it works was going to be 100 pages long, and that's what that guy told me. And my grant sponsor said the same thing. So two different sources. This leads me to speculation. What do they cut out of it? And what the archivist told me was he heard that it was a much broader breakdown of step 4, and perhaps even an explanation of the harm inventory, which has been rumored it was taken out. But I also read that a lot of the pages were about way too much about fear, which has been written in some outside books that they just trimmed out on the one page, and because it was too deep. And that's one of the reasons why Bill wrote 12 and 12 eventually, to go deeper on this stuff. So that, here's the crazy part of all that stuff, all the hearsay, is when they put the original drafts in barrels because they wanted to hold on to them. And when they moved to um, the larger office where they're at now, they didn't want to move the barrels, so they just threw them away. They all got thrown in the garbage can. So no one will ever know what's in those 800 pages. But the original title of the book was Book of Experience, and it evolved into 100 Men. Then it evolved into for a minute, it was going to be called The Way Out. Then some people wanted it to be called the Wilson Movement, which Bill did not. And then the final choice that they stuck was Alcoholics Anonymous, which was, I believe, I forget the guy's name that came up with it, but he just put it on a chair outside of one of the meetings, and someone said, hey, just write that, write there's a meeting here, and he wrote Alcoholics Anonymous. And someone goes, hey, it's stuck. It was the name of a meeting. And Bill's secretary, Nell Wing, typed the book with Bill, and Bill would be over her shoulder, her son's right next to her ear, going over stuff to bring back to the committee, and they would make changes, and they would be brought back to her to make more changes. Soon they had what's called the original manuscript, and the book, it's, if you want to get one, if you don't have this already, this one is amazing, the book that started it all. And it has the original manuscript in here of what it looked like typed. And then it has, if you get into how it works, you can see how much stuff is edited out and scribbled by the committees and stuff. That's the committee's handwriting. That's not Bill's. That's the committee's. So if you can get this book, if you already have it, you know about it. But what's interesting is the manuscript was put, it was interesting. It sold 2 years ago, and the guy sold the Hazelton, and Hazelton put this out, did a great job of it for $2.5 million. And that's just some examples of that book, but it's called The Book That Started All. You can find it on Amazon. It's like $60. It's worth every penny because you get a feel for the big book. So in early 39, they had cleaned up enough of the book to bring it to the publisher. And so April 39, I think it's April 10th, 4,730 copies of the first edition of Alcoholics Anonymous were published. $3.50. Very expensive for its time. That's the equivalent of $60 today. And it came out with very little fanfare. It did not sell. They sent direct mail announcements of the book to 20,000 physicians, and they got 2 orders out of it. Reviews in the American Medical Association called the book propaganda. the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease, who are a very crooked group, by the way, because they're the ones that want Alcoholics in Silence, called the book religious extortion with a bunch of big words and rambling. Nearly 40, almost all, 4,700 pages sat in a warehouse, and Works Publishing was going bankrupt. But then it changed. In 1941, Saturday Evening Post posted a very positive article about the book. Another positive article came out in the New York Times stating that the thesis of the book had more sound base than any psychological book ever written before. It's pretty deep. And that the book was unlike any other book ever published. Another one they don't talk about a lot was Green Magazine published an article and called the big book perhaps the greatest liberating force of the 20th century. That's deep. Another review that said there was hope now because we finally had something put together by former alcoholics for alcoholics. I love that. And another critic called it extraordinary and deserved attention, worldwide attention. You know, AA started receiving inquiries from other countries around the world, and it took 2 years. But after the first printing, 2 years of the first printing, we were able to sell all 4,700 copies. They did it. The book Alcoholics Anonymous is perhaps one of the best-selling books of all time. 50 million copies worldwide, over 50 million. So if you look at it from 39 to 55, 300,000 copies of the first edition were distributed. 55 to 76, 1.1 million. Second edition, there's a second edition. And in the third edition, 76, 2002, 19 million, almost 20 million, 19 million, 500,000 were, almost 20 million were sent out. 2002 to present, 30 million. That's crazy. Almost 20 years, almost 20 years. That's, the other one is, all the other ones were a little bit longer period of time. The crazy thing is we have I always bring this up, and I'll bring it up again, but we got 2.5 million members of Alcoholics Anonymous, which I think it's probably more around 5, but for some reason they stopped the growth, and I have a theory around that. I'll explain later when we get to the stats. But I always wonder, like, 30 million big books have been printed in 20 years. Where's all the big books? And it's because AA is a revolving door. People come in and out. That's the low recovery rates of Alcoholics Anonymous present time. Scary. We get back to present time. In 2011, Time Magazine placed the big book high on its list of most influential books ever written. It's a great article. You can find it. The Library of Congress designated it as one of the 88 books that shaped America. Pretty impressive. The first edition printings today, first edition, first printings sell for as much as $250,000. And so if you find one in a garage sale, I have a couple second editions, but not a first. I have the copy one, this one that came out, which is, I'll explain that in a minute. But perhaps the biggest change, there are only a few changes in the books. The biggest changes, the stories are always changing, but the biggest change in the big book that's ever been done was changing spiritual experience and spiritual awakening. So after the first printing, it originally said having had a spiritual experience resolve these steps. They changed it to spiritual awakening because members were coming to him and saying, we weren't having an awakening, we're having an experience. And it was the people who really read William James's book, So in the second printing came out, they changed step 12 from spiritual experience to spiritual awakening. They added the spiritual penance in the back of the book to differentiate the difference between the two. There's other minor things. Ex-alcoholic was used throughout the first edition, was changed to ex-problem drinker and non-alcoholic. In other words, a couple of other different words. When the second edition came out in 55, they renumbered the pages. They put a lot of people don't realize this. In the first edition, Bill's story, Doc's opinion was on page 1, and Bill's story was on what, page 9 or whatever it was. And 55, when the second edition came out, the Doctor's opinion was pushed back to the Roman numerals, and Bill was the story was 1, and then pretty sure it was Bill. There's a whole story on that. But then, the new forwards in the volume changes, the Roman numerals a little bit, and words like, hundreds have changed to thousands. There's footnotes have been added. Here's something that's real interesting. People always ask, you see, go to a bookstore, you'll see a generic big book. And the reason that is simple. It's public domain. The first and second edition. It's just, the U.S. copyright of the first edition expired in 1967, and then they didn't discover it until 85 when the second edition expired 2 years earlier, and in 83. So they said, screw it. They just forgot. They didn't even think about it. So they're public domain. So anyone, you can take that's like, you ever seen the anonymous press one that has the notes next to it? Anyone can print a big book and sell it. You just can't use anything relevant to the third and fourth edition. So, it's just the first 164 pages. The big question is, why is it named the Big Book? And this was all Hank Parkhurst. See, you can't really see it on here, but thick pages, and it kind of goes like this, and it was really outdated material. Thick pages were used, and it was a heavy binding and sewn with machines and stuff that they didn't use anymore. And the paper in the books, rather than using the new style, we used with the older, thicker pages to save money. But to sell them, because they wanted the book to look beautiful, Hank sold them that if you use the thicker pages, right, people are going to think they got their money's worth, so we can up the price. That was their theory. And the bright color of it, they wanted something, and I think it was Ruth Hawk, one of the secretaries, that said, hey, look at this. It was some drawing they had or something like that. Why don't we make it this bright? And they did. They wanted to be seen across the room. And it's bright, first edition. The name Big Book was referred to in the second edition. The Cleveland group called it the Big Book. And I mean, they were the ones that always called it the Big Book. Everyone had called it because it's so big. But the Cleveland group was the first group to sponsor out of the Big Book. Before that, they were still doing Oxford group stuff. And there's a lot of crazy stuff that happened with Clarence Snyder and those guys. And Snyder tried to take credit that he should have been founder of AA because of the fact that he was sponsoring on the Big Book and all this stuff. And it was a bunch of crazy stuff. But people, people are drawn to this book, because of the vast, it saves so many lives. This book sat in front of me for 10 years. I never got more than 3 months sober, and I got past the third step and went to rehab 7 times, but it was up there in the front, and I knew it was there, but it saved a lot of lives, and it helped save my own. It didn't save me. It helped me save my, life. It's like, I don't say my sponsor saved my life. He just pointed the direction. We do it, when they made this book, they basically broke the mold. This is the best way to put it. There's so much joy that I get talking about the Big Book. I love book studies. I love the history. I keep going deeper in it, but that's about it, talking about that. But I'm going to stop the recording. So if people want to share or ask questions, anything they want to say, let me stop.